The DNA test results trembled in Elena Corvelli's weathered hands as she stared at the name that had haunted her nightmares for 23 years, Gabriel Romano, the son she had raised, loved, and called her own since he was 5 years old, was the biological child of Vincent Romano, the man who had murdered her husband and destroyed her family in cold blood. The irony was so cruel it felt like divine punishment. The boy she had saved from an orphanage and raised as her son was now desperately in love with her daughter Sophia, creating a twisted family dynamic that threatened to shatter everything she had rebuilt from the ashes of her former life. As she watched Gabriel and Sophia laughing together in the garden outside her window, their hands intertwined in the innocent joy of first love, Elena realized that the past she had tried so hard to bury was about to destroy not just her own carefully constructed peace, but the hearts of the two young people she loved more than her own life. The story had begun 23 years earlier, when Elena Romano, she had been a different person then, with a different name and a different life, was married to Detective Michael Corvelli, a decorated police officer who specialized in investigating organized crime families. They lived in a modest but happy home with their newborn daughter Sophia, and Michael was on the verge of bringing down the most powerful crime syndicate in the city, the Romano family, led by the ruthless Vincent Romano. Elena remembered those days with painful clarity, the way Michael would come home exhausted but triumphant, telling her about the evidence he was gathering, the witnesses he was protecting, the case he was building that would finally put Vincent Romano behind bars for life. "We're so close, Elena," he would whisper to her as they lay in bed listening to baby Sophia's gentle breathing from the nursery. "A few more weeks, and we'll have enough evidence to take down the entire organization. Vincent Romano will never hurt another innocent person again." But Vincent Romano had learned about Michael's investigation before the detective could complete his case. The attack on the Corvelli family home had been swift, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Elena still remembered every detail of that terrible night, the sound of breaking glass, the masked men rushing through their front door, the terror in Michael's eyes as he pushed Elena and baby Sophia toward the back bedroom while reaching for his service weapon. The gunshots that followed had echoed through her soul for decades, along with Vincent Romano's cold voice as he stood over Michael's dying body. "This is what happens to people who interfere with my family's business. Let this be a lesson to anyone else who thinks they can destroy what I've built." Elena had hidden in the closet with Sophia, pressing her hand over her daughter's mouth to keep her from crying while Vincent's men searched the house, setting fires that would make Michael's death look like the result of a home invasion gone wrong. The official investigation into Detective Michael Corvelli's murder had been compromised from the beginning, with corrupt officers ensuring that evidence disappeared and witnesses changed their stories. Vincent Romano's alibi was airtight, his lawyers were the best money could buy, and the case was eventually closed as an unsolved home invasion with no suspects. Elena had been forced to enter witness protection with baby Sophia, taking on new identities and moving across the country to start over in a place where Vincent Romano's influence couldn't reach them. She became Elena Corvelli, keeping her late husband's name as a way of honoring his memory while hiding her original identity as the wife of the detective who had nearly brought down the Romano crime family. The witness protection program had given them safety but not peace. Elena struggled with depression, trauma, and the constant fear that Vincent Romano would somehow discover their location and finish what he had started. She worked multiple jobs to support herself and Sophia, moving frequently whenever she felt they might have been discovered, always looking over her shoulder and teaching her daughter to be cautious about trusting strangers. Sophia grew up knowing that her father had been a hero who died protecting people, but Elena had never told her daughter the specific details about Vincent Romano or the crime family that had destroyed their lives. Gabriel had entered their lives when he was 5 years old and Elena was working at a children's shelter in Oregon. She had been volunteering there as a way of dealing with her own grief and trauma, finding some measure of healing in helping other damaged children. Gabriel was different from the other orphans, quiet, intelligent, and heartbreakingly polite in the way that children become when they've learned too early that the world is a dangerous place. He had been found abandoned at a hospital when he was 3, with no identification and no memory of his life before that moment. The doctors suspected he had suffered some kind of trauma that had caused selective amnesia, but despite extensive investigations, no family members had ever been located. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Elena had asked him during one of her volunteer shifts, kneeling down to his eye level as he sat alone in the corner of the playroom. "Gabriel," he had whispered, his dark eyes wide with the kind of sadness that no child should ever have to carry. "But I don't remember my other name. I don't remember anything about before." Elena had felt an immediate connection to this lost little boy, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit who had also lost everything and been forced to start over with a new identity. She began spending more time with Gabriel during her volunteer hours, reading to him, helping him with his letters, and slowly watching him come out of his shell as he learned to trust her. When the opportunity arose to become his foster mother, Elena had barely hesitated. Despite her own struggles and the challenges of raising Sophia as a single mother, she felt called to help this damaged child who had no one else in the world. The adoption process had been lengthy but ultimately successful, and Gabriel legally became Gabriel Corvelli when he was 6 years old. Elena had been careful to run background checks and work with authorities to ensure there were no living relatives who might claim him later, but the investigation had turned up nothing. Gabriel's origins remained a mystery, which seemed perfect for a woman who was herself living under an assumed identity. She told him that his past didn't matter, what mattered was the family they were building together, the love they shared, and the future they would create as a unit. Gabriel had thrived in Elena's care, growing from a traumatized, silent child into a thoughtful, compassionate young man who excelled academically and seemed destined for great things. He and Sophia had bonded immediately, with 10-year-old Sophia taking on the role of protective big sister to her new little brother. Elena had watched them grow up together with joy and pride, seeing in their close relationship the kind of family bond she had always dreamed of creating. Gabriel called her "Mom" from the very beginning, and Elena loved him with the same fierce devotion she felt for Sophia. He wasn't just her adopted son, he was truly her child in every way that mattered. But as Gabriel grew older, Elena began to notice troubling similarities between him and someone from her past, similarities that she initially dismissed as coincidence but that became harder to ignore over time. Gabriel's eyes, when he was angry or determined, had the same cold intensity that she remembered from Vincent Romano. His smile, when he was being charming or persuasive, had the same dangerous charisma that had made Vincent so effective at manipulating people. Most disturbing of all, Gabriel had a natural aptitude for strategic thinking and leadership that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the criminal mastermind who had destroyed her family. These observations had remained buried in Elena's subconscious for years, surfacing only during moments of stress or when Gabriel displayed personality traits that seemed inconsistent with his gentle upbringing. She had convinced herself that she was being paranoid, that her trauma was causing her to see threats where none existed, and that Gabriel's occasional flashes of intensity were simply normal aspects of his personality rather than signs of some darker heritage. The romantic relationship between Gabriel and Sophia had developed gradually over their teenage years, evolving from sibling affection into something deeper and more complex. Elena had initially been concerned about the potential complications of adopted siblings falling in love, but she had also recognized that they weren't biologically related and that their feelings seemed genuine and healthy. Gabriel, now 23, was completing his graduate degree in business while Sophia, now 23 as well, was working as a social worker helping disadvantaged families. Both of them had chosen careers that reflected the values Elena had instilled in them. "I know it might seem strange that we fell in love," Gabriel had told Elena 6 months earlier when he asked for her permission to propose to Sophia. "But she's not just my sister, she's my best friend, my closest confidant, and the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. I can't imagine loving anyone the way I love her." Elena had been moved by his sincerity and impressed by the thoughtful way he had approached their relationship, taking time to consider the family dynamics and ensure that their romance wouldn't damage the bonds between all of them. But the DNA test that now lay crumpled in Elena's hands had changed everything. She had ordered the test on a whim, prompted by a genealogy project that Sophia was working on for a college course. Elena had thought it would be interesting for both Gabriel and Sophia to learn more about their heritage, never imagining that the results would reveal her worst nightmare. The report was unambiguous. Gabriel Romano was the son of Vincent Romano and Maria Santos, born 28 years ago and reported missing when he was 3 years old after his mother's death in what police had ruled a drug overdose. The realization that Gabriel was Vincent Romano's son hit Elena like a physical blow, making her question everything she thought she knew about the boy she had raised. Had his abandonment at the hospital been orchestrated somehow? Was his selective amnesia real, or had he been coached to forget his origins? Most terrifying of all, had Vincent Romano somehow arranged for his son to be placed with Elena as part of some elaborate long-term plan for revenge? The thought that she might have been unknowingly harboring the son of her husband's killer for 23 years filled her with a nausea so profound she had to sit down to keep from fainting. But even as Elena grappled with this horrifying revelation, another part of her mind rebelled against the implications. Gabriel was not Vincent Romano, he was the gentle, thoughtful young man she had raised, who cried when he saw injured animals, who volunteered at homeless shelters, who had never shown any inclination toward violence or criminal behavior. The idea that genetics could predetermine someone's character or that Gabriel was somehow destined to become like his biological father seemed both scientifically unsound and morally repugnant. The internal conflict between Elena's terror and her maternal love created a psychological crisis that left her paralyzed with indecision. Should she confront Gabriel with the truth about his parentage? Should she tell Sophia that the man she loved was the son of the person who had murdered her father? Should she contact the authorities and report that Vincent Romano's long-missing son had been living under an assumed identity? Each option seemed to lead to devastating consequences that would destroy the family she had worked so hard to rebuild. The decision was made for her when Vincent Romano himself appeared at Elena's front door 3 days later, flanked by 2 bodyguards and wearing the same coldly confident expression she remembered from the night he had murdered her husband. 23 years had aged him, his dark hair was now silver, his face more lined, his body slightly heavier, but his eyes still held the same ruthless intelligence that had made him one of the most feared crime bosses in the country. "Hello, Elena," he said, using her real name with casual familiarity that made her blood run cold. "I think it's time we had a conversation about my son." The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of Vincent Romano's patience and the complexity of his long-term planning. He had known exactly where Gabriel was for the past 20 years, had been monitoring his development through a network of informants and surveillance, and had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim his heir. Gabriel's placement in the orphanage hadn't been accidental, it had been carefully orchestrated after his mother Maria's death, which hadn't been a drug overdose but rather a murder committed by rival crime families who were trying to eliminate Vincent's bloodline. "I couldn't keep Gabriel with me during those early years," Vincent explained with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss business arrangements. "The war between the families was too dangerous, and he was too young to defend himself. But I always planned to bring him home when he was old enough to understand his heritage and take his place in the organization." Elena stared at the man who had destroyed her life, struggling to process what he was telling her. "You knew I had him," she said, her voice barely audible. "You knew that your son was living with the widow of the detective you murdered." Vincent's smile was coldly amused. "I knew exactly who you were from the moment you adopted him. In fact, I orchestrated the entire adoption process to ensure Gabriel would be raised by someone with the strength and intelligence necessary to prepare him for his destiny. Who better to raise the future head of the Romano family than the woman who survived my best attempts to destroy her?" The revelation that Gabriel's entire childhood had been part of Vincent's elaborate plan was devastating enough, but the implications for Elena's relationship with her adopted son were even more horrifying. If Vincent had been monitoring Gabriel's development all along, then Gabriel's personality, his values, his love for Elena and Sophia, everything that made him who he was, might have been shaped by Vincent's influence rather than Elena's care. But Vincent's next words revealed an even more twisted dimension to his long-term strategy. "Gabriel doesn't know who I am yet," he continued, "but he will soon. I've been waiting for him to reach emotional maturity and form strong attachments before revealing his true heritage. The bond he's formed with your daughter Sophia will ensure his loyalty to this family, even after he learns the truth about his origins." Elena felt her world tilting on its axis as she understood the full scope of Vincent's manipulation. He hadn't just been patient about reclaiming his son, he had been actively engineering Gabriel's emotional development to serve his own purposes. Gabriel's love for Sophia wasn't just a family complication, it was a chain that Vincent planned to use to control his son and, by extension, to control Elena herself. What do you want from us? Elena asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. I want my son to take his rightful place as head of the Romano organization, Vincent replied. He's been raised with the moral flexibility and strategic intelligence necessary to lead, but he lacks the hardness that comes from understanding the true nature of power. That's where you come in. I need you to tell Gabriel who his real father is, and I need you to help him understand why family loyalty must come before everything else, including his feelings for your daughter. The ultimatum was clear. Elena could either cooperate with Vincent's plan to transform Gabriel into his criminal heir, or she could watch her family be destroyed by the revelation of truths that would tear apart everything they had built together. Vincent had positioned himself to win regardless of what Elena chose. If she refused to cooperate, he would simply reveal Gabriel's parentage himself, along with Elena's true identity and the fact that she had been living under false pretenses for over 20 years. But the most insidious aspect of Vincent's plan was his understanding of human psychology and family dynamics. He knew that Gabriel's love for Elena and Sophia would make him vulnerable to manipulation, that his sense of identity was tied to his relationships rather than his genetics, and that the revelation of his true parentage would create a psychological crisis that could be exploited to shape his future choices. The conversation was interrupted by Gabriel's return from his graduate classes, his arrival at the house creating a surreal tableau as Elena found herself in the position of having to interact normally with her adopted son while his biological father, the man who had murdered her husband, stood in her living room. Gabriel's initial confusion at seeing strangers in his home quickly gave way to protective concern when he noticed Elena's obvious distress. "Mom, is everything okay?" Gabriel asked, moving to stand between Elena and Vincent in a gesture that was both touching and tragically ironic. "Who are these men, and why do you look so upset?" Vincent studied his biological son with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased with Gabriel's instinctive protectiveness and commanding presence. "Hello, Gabriel," he said warmly. "My name is Vincent Romano, and I have something very important to tell you about who you really are." The revelation that followed was handled with Vincent's characteristic manipulation and strategic thinking. Rather than simply announcing that Gabriel was his son, he presented the information as part of a larger story about family heritage, loyalty, and destiny. He spoke about Gabriel's mother Maria with genuine emotion, describing her as a beautiful and intelligent woman who had died protecting her son from enemies who wanted to eliminate the Romano bloodline. He portrayed the crime family as a protective organization that took care of its members and maintained order in a chaotic world. Gabriel's reaction was everything Elena had feared and more. The young man she had raised to value honesty, compassion, and justice struggled visibly to reconcile this new information with his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He looked back and forth between Vincent and Elena, searching for confirmation or denial of what he was being told, clearly hoping that the woman he called mother would somehow make sense of this devastating revelation. "Is it true?" Gabriel asked Elena, his voice breaking with emotion. "Is he really my father? Have you known all along who I was?" Elena's response was one of the most difficult moments of her life, requiring her to choose between protecting Gabriel from the truth and risking his safety, or telling him everything and watching his world collapse around him. She chose honesty, knowing that Vincent would eventually reveal everything anyway and that Gabriel deserved to hear the complete story from someone who loved him rather than someone who wanted to use him. "I didn't know until 3 days ago," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I ordered DNA tests for a family project, and the results showed that Vincent Romano is your biological father. But Gabriel, you need to understand something else. Vincent Romano is also the man who murdered your father. He's the man who destroyed our family and forced us to live in hiding for over 20 years." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Gabriel's ragged breathing as he tried to process information that redefined everything he thought he knew about himself and his family. Elena watched her adopted son's face cycle through shock, confusion, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like recognition, as if some deep part of his subconscious had always known there were secrets about his origins. Vincent's response to Elena's revelation was coldly strategic rather than defensive. "Your mother is telling the truth about the past," he told Gabriel, "but she's not telling you the complete truth about why those events happened." Detective Corvelli wasn't just investigating organized crime, he was working with rival families to destroy legitimate businesses that employed thousands of people. He was corrupt, taking money from our enemies while pretending to uphold justice. I did what was necessary to protect my family and my community. The competing narratives presented Gabriel with an impossible choice between two versions of reality, each supported by people he had reason to trust. Elena's version cast Vincent as a murderous criminal who had destroyed an innocent family, while Vincent's version portrayed Detective Corvelli as a corrupt cop who had been eliminated in the service of a greater good. Gabriel had no way of knowing which story was true, and both Elena and Vincent understood that his decision would determine not just his own future, but the future of everyone he loved. The psychological pressure of this revelation was compounded by Sophia's arrival home from work, her cheerful greeting dying on her lips as she sensed the tension in the room and noticed the strangers who had clearly upset her mother and the man she loved. Gabriel's attempt to protect Sophia from the truth proved futile, as Vincent had no intention of allowing any secrets to remain hidden now that his long-term plan was finally in motion. "Sophia," Vincent said with the same warm tone he had used with Gabriel, "I'm Vincent Romano, Gabriel's biological father. I've come to reunite with my son and to discuss some important family matters that affect all of you." Sophia's reaction was immediate and visceral. She had grown up knowing that her father had been murdered by Vincent Romano, and seeing the man responsible for her family's destruction standing in their living room filled her with a rage so pure it was almost blinding. But her anger was complicated by her love for Gabriel and her concern for what this revelation meant for their relationship and their future together. "You're the man who killed my father," Sophia said, her voice shaking with fury and pain. "You destroyed our family, forced us to live in hiding, and now you want to take Gabriel away from us too. Haven't you done enough damage?" Vincent's response revealed the depth of his understanding of human psychology and his skill at manipulation. Rather than dismissing Sophia's pain or defending his past actions, he acknowledged her suffering while reframing it as part of a larger tragedy that had affected all of them. He spoke about the cycle of violence that had claimed Detective Corvelli's life, Gabriel's mother Maria, and numerous other innocent people caught in the crossfire between competing crime families. "I understand your anger, Sophia," Vincent said with apparent sincerity, "and I don't expect you to forgive me for the pain I've caused your family. But I hope you can understand that Gabriel is innocent of any crimes his father may have committed, just as you are innocent of any mistakes your father may have made. The question now is whether we can find a way to move forward that honors the memory of the dead while protecting the living." The conversation that followed forced all of them to confront difficult questions about family loyalty, inherited guilt, and the possibility of redemption across generational lines. Gabriel struggled with the revelation that he was the son of the man who had murdered his adopted sister's father, while Sophia grappled with the fact that her romantic partner was genetically connected to her family's destroyer. Elena found herself in the impossible position of trying to protect both of her children while navigating the complex emotions triggered by Vincent's reappearance in her life. But the most challenging aspect of the situation was Gabriel's growing curiosity about his biological heritage and his family's history. Despite Elena's teachings about compassion and justice, Gabriel was drawn to Vincent's stories about the Romano family's power and influence, their ability to protect their members and punish their enemies. The young man who had been raised to believe in working within the system to help others was suddenly confronted with an alternative philosophy that suggested sometimes justice required operating outside legal boundaries. The internal conflict was visible in Gabriel's questions and comments over the following days, as Vincent remained in the area and continued to meet with his biological son. What if some of the people Dad was investigating really were corrupt? Gabriel asked Elena one evening. What if Vincent's family was actually trying to clean up the system from the inside? What if everything we've believed about good and evil isn't as clear-cut as we thought? Elena recognized the dangerous territory Gabriel was entering, the same intellectual flexibility and moral relativism that had allowed Vincent Romano to justify decades of criminal behavior. She understood that Gabriel's questions weren't just academic curiosity, they were the beginning of a psychological transformation that could lead him away from everything she had tried to teach him and toward the dark legacy of his biological father. The crisis came to a head when Vincent presented Gabriel with an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity. The Romano family business had evolved over the past 20 years, moving away from traditional organized crime activities toward more sophisticated financial operations that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal behavior. Vincent offered Gabriel the chance to take over these operations, to use his intelligence and education to transform the family's influence into something that could genuinely benefit their community. "I'm not asking you to become a criminal," Vincent explained during a private conversation with Gabriel that Elena overheard from the next room. "I'm asking you to become a leader who understands that sometimes the system is too broken to fix from within. Your mother raised you with strong moral principles, and I respect that. But she also sheltered you from the reality of how power really works in this world. I'm offering you the chance to use your education and your values to create real change, to protect people who can't protect themselves, and to build something better than what came before." The offer was seductive precisely because it wasn't a simple choice between good and evil, but rather a complex decision about how to use power responsibly in an imperfect world. Gabriel was being asked to choose between the safe, conventional path Elena had laid out for him and the challenging, morally ambiguous path Vincent was offering. Both options involved helping people and fighting injustice, but they required very different approaches to achieving those goals. Elena's counterargument focused not on the moral implications of Gabriel's choice, but on the psychological trap Vincent was setting for him. "He's not offering you the chance to reform his organization," she warned Gabriel during a heated discussion about his future. "He's offering you the chance to become him. Every compromise you make, every time you bend the rules for what seems like a good reason, you'll move a little further away from the person you are now. Before you know it, you'll be justifying actions you never thought you'd be capable of, and you'll have become everything you once stood against." But Gabriel's response revealed how effectively Vincent's manipulation was working. "Maybe becoming him wouldn't be entirely bad," Gabriel said, his voice carrying a hardness Elena had never heard before. "Maybe the world needs people who are willing to do whatever it takes to protect the innocent, even if that means getting their hands dirty. Maybe Dad was killed because he was too naive to understand the reality of the situation he was in." The transformation in Gabriel's thinking was gradual but unmistakable, and Elena watched with growing horror as the gentle, idealistic young man she had raised began to adopt the cold pragmatism that had made Vincent Romano so dangerous. Gabriel started questioning the effectiveness of legal approaches to social problems, expressing frustration with bureaucratic limitations on helping people, and showing interest in more direct methods of achieving justice. The situation became even more complicated when Sophia discovered that she was pregnant with Gabriel's child, a development that added new urgency to the family's need to resolve their conflicts. The pregnancy represented both a blessing and a potential weapon in Vincent's psychological warfare. He could use Gabriel's desire to protect his unborn child as leverage to ensure his cooperation with the family business. "A child changes everything," Vincent told Gabriel when he learned about the pregnancy. "You're not just making decisions for yourself anymore, you're making decisions that will affect your son or daughter for generations. The Romano family can provide security, education, and opportunities that will ensure your child never has to struggle or fear for their safety. But those benefits come with responsibilities and loyalties that can't be abandoned when they become inconvenient." Elena understood that Vincent was using the pregnancy to accelerate Gabriel's psychological transformation, creating a sense of urgency that would push him toward making decisions based on emotion rather than careful consideration. The promise of protecting his child would appeal to Gabriel's deepest instincts, while the implied threat to that child's safety if he refused to cooperate would add pressure to accept Vincent's offer. But the pregnancy also gave Elena an idea for countering Vincent's manipulation. She arranged for Gabriel and Sophia to meet with Maria Santos's sister, Carmen, who had been searching for her nephew for over 20 years. Carmen's story provided a very different perspective on Vincent Romano and the true cost of being part of his family. "Your mother wasn't a drug addict who died of an overdose," Carmen told Gabriel during their emotional meeting. "She was a gentle, loving woman who tried to leave Vincent when she realized what kind of man he really was. She was planning to take you and disappear, to start over somewhere Vincent couldn't find you. But Vincent discovered her plan, and he had her killed to prevent her from taking you away from him. The overdose was staged to cover up the murder, and you were abandoned at the hospital because Vincent couldn't risk keeping you while he was at war with rival families. The revelation that Vincent had murdered Gabriel's mother as well as his adoptive father created a new crisis in Gabriel's understanding of his biological parent. Carmen's story was supported by documents, photographs, and testimony from witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward 20 years earlier but were now willing to speak because Vincent's power had diminished with age and legal troubles. Gabriel's reaction to learning the truth about his mother's death was explosive and heartbreaking. The young man who had been seduced by Vincent's promises of power and protection suddenly understood that his biological father was not a misunderstood protector fighting for justice, but a manipulative killer who destroyed everyone who tried to leave him or oppose him. The realization that Vincent had murdered both of Gabriel's parents, biological and adoptive, while pretending to offer him love and guidance was devastating. But Vincent's response to Gabriel's newfound knowledge was characteristically ruthless and strategic. Rather than denying Carmen's accusations or trying to justify his past actions, he embraced them as proof of his commitment to family loyalty and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what belonged to him. "Your mother betrayed our family," Vincent told Gabriel with cold finality. "She was planning to steal my son and disappear, to raise you with lies about who you were and where you came from. I couldn't allow that betrayal to succeed, just as I can't allow Elena's influence to turn you against your true heritage. Family loyalty isn't always comfortable or convenient, but it's the only thing that matters when everything else fails." The confrontation that followed forced Gabriel to make the choice that had been building throughout the entire crisis. He could accept Vincent's philosophy of family loyalty above all else, joining the Romano organization and using his intelligence to modernize their criminal operations. Or he could reject his biological heritage entirely, choosing to remain with Elena and Sofia while accepting that Vincent would view this choice as a betrayal that required punishment. Gabriel's decision came during a dramatic scene at the Romano family compound, where Vincent had arranged a formal ceremony to welcome his son into the organization. The event was attended by dozens of family members and associates, all of whom were eager to meet the heir who had been lost for so long and had now returned to claim his birthright. Elena and Sofia had been invited as witnesses, though it was clear they were expected to be passive observers rather than participants in Gabriel's transformation. The ceremony itself was elaborate and ritualistic, designed to create psychological pressure through spectacle and tradition. Gabriel was presented with family heirlooms, introduced to relatives he had never met, and given a detailed history of the Romano family's achievements and sacrifices over multiple generations. Vincent spoke eloquently about legacy, duty, and the responsibilities that came with power, painting a picture of Gabriel as the chosen successor who would lead the family into a new era of prosperity and influence. But when the moment came for Gabriel to formally accept his position in the organization, his response surprised everyone in attendance. Instead of the grateful acceptance Vincent had expected, Gabriel delivered a speech that rejected everything his biological father represented while affirming everything Elena had taught him about love, loyalty, and moral courage. "I am grateful to know the truth about my origins," Gabriel said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent compound. "But knowing where I came from doesn't determine where I'm going. Vincent Romano may be my biological father, but he's not my dad. He's not the man who taught me right from wrong, who held me when I was sick, who celebrated my achievements and helped me through my failures. That man was Detective Michael Corvelli, whose memory I honor by choosing to fight for justice through legal means rather than criminal ones." Gabriel's rejection of Vincent's offer was total and uncompromising, but it was delivered with the kind of principled courage that reminded everyone present of the moral education Elena had provided. He spoke about choosing love over power, family bonds over blood ties, and the importance of breaking cycles of violence rather than perpetuating them. His words were those of a young man who understood exactly what he was giving up and what he was choosing instead. Vincent's reaction was swift and predictably violent. Gabriel's public rejection of the Romano family heritage was not just a personal betrayal but a challenge to Vincent's authority that could not be allowed to stand without consequences. The ceremony dissolved into chaos as Vincent's associates moved to surround Gabriel, Elena, and Sofia, clearly intending to ensure that Gabriel's defiance would not be repeated or inspire others to similar acts of rebellion. But Gabriel's rejection had been accompanied by careful planning and preparation. Working with Elena and law enforcement contacts she had maintained since her witness protection days, Gabriel had arranged for the ceremony to be monitored by FBI agents who had been building a case against the Romano family for years. Vincent's reaction to Gabriel's defiance provided the final evidence needed to obtain federal arrest warrants for multiple members of the organization. The arrests that followed were dramatic and comprehensive, effectively dismantling the Romano crime family's operations and ensuring that Vincent's threats against Gabriel and his chosen family could not be carried out. Vincent himself was charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering, facing a life sentence that would ensure he could never again manipulate or threaten the people Gabriel loved. The aftermath of Vincent's arrest and the destruction of his criminal empire allowed Gabriel, Elena, and Sophia to begin the process of healing from the trauma that had been inflicted on their family. The revelation of Gabriel's true parentage had initially threatened to tear them apart, but their decision to face the crisis together had ultimately strengthened their bonds and confirmed that family was defined by choice rather than genetics. Gabriel's wedding to Sophia took place 6 months later, officiated by the same priest who had baptized both of them as children and attended by the extended family of friends and colleagues who had supported them through their ordeal. Elena walked both Gabriel and Sophia down the aisle, symbolizing her role as the mother who had raised them both and given them the values that had enabled them to choose love over hatred. During the ceremony, Gabriel spoke about the difference between inherited traits and chosen character, acknowledging his biological connection to Vincent Romano while affirming his spiritual and emotional connection to the family that had raised him with love and integrity. "I learned that we are not prisoners of our genetics or our circumstances," he said during his vows to Sophia. "We are the authors of our own stories, and we can choose to write ourselves as heroes rather than victims, as builders rather than destroyers." The birth of Gabriel and Sophia's daughter, Maria Elena Romano Corvelli, named for both of Gabriel's mothers, represented the triumph of love over hatred and the beginning of a new generation that would be raised with the knowledge of their complex family history but not burdened by its sins. Elena held her granddaughter for the first time with tears of joy and relief, knowing that the cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives had finally been broken. The story of the adopted enemy had ended not with the destruction that Vincent Romano had planned, but with the creation of something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Gabriel had chosen to honor the man who had raised him rather than the man who had fathered him. Sophia had chosen to love the person Gabriel had become rather than fear the family he had come from, and Elena had learned that the love she had given freely to an orphan child had ultimately redeemed not just Gabriel, but her entire family's future. In the final scene, as Elena watched Gabriel teaching his daughter to walk in the same garden where she had first seen him playing as a frightened 5-year-old, she reflected on the power of love to transform even the most damaged hearts and the most impossible circumstances. The DNA test that had once threatened to destroy her family had ultimately proven that the strongest bonds are not those created by blood, but those forged through choice, sacrifice, and the daily decision to choose compassion over revenge, hope over despair, and love over fear.